This is PS 207-003, going over the paper. Let's see. This time last time I started with the paper, this time I'm gonna try the rubric first and see if that might make a little more sense. So the APA rubric. This one, it's pretty much mechanics. Either it was there or it wasn't. And I'm not looking so much at the content of what anything is. I'm looking at the formatting, except for a couple specific things at the end. For your final paper, so as I've talked about, I'm expecting to see improvement from your revised draft, the one that I graded, to your final paper that you're turning in. My goal for everybody in this class is to have 100 on the APA rubric, because we've gone over, really half this class has been devoted to this paper, and a lot of it has focused on APA style. So my goal is that, my expectation is that you'll be able to fix everything with the feedback. And so when I think of that percentage of how much things have changed, which I'll talk about a little more in a minute, really, I'm looking for everyone to get perfect scores on APA style. Most of it is very much mechanics, margins, font, indents. A lot of people struggled with the abstract, with the indents, especially keywords, which has some funky formatting. The best tip I can give you for how to do APA formatting well is to keep up a sample, which could be the rubric, or the template, and your paper side by side, and keep checking, do they look the same? Is the formatting the same in the heading? Are the indents the same? Abstract, I had said I wasn't going to be, too firm on the abstract length, but what I found was that almost everyone's was shorter than I wanted it to be. So I think in the future, especially for future classes, I'm really going to stress that it needs to be between 150 and 250 words. Usually, if yours was a little short, a good way to plump it up is to just add a limitation. Add some of your limitations, some of your future study ideas and practice applications into your abstract, because your abstract is meant to be a little more complete than any of your other overview papers or overview paragraphs. So the body, it's things like your headings, what's capitalized and what's not. And again, this is where it's helpful to just look at a sample paper. Even when I'm grading, I tend to have a printed out sample paper next to me. I print it out like 4 to a page, something really tiny, just so I can look to see, okay, that one's not bold, and you have it bold. So just checking these little details. This is also a lot of stuff that it's helpful to do another peer review. There's no more built into the class, but to have a time that you sit down with someone else and say, all right, let's each just, a lot of this formatting stuff, I find it helpful to print it out, because when I print it out, I see it differently than I see it on the screen. I see it with fresh eyes, and I can mark it. I just read it differently when it's on paper. And so I do almost all of my writing on the computer, but then when it's getting to these final edits, I find it extremely helpful to do a hard copy, and I've heard a lot of other writers say the same thing. Or even things like pulling it up on a tablet instead of your computer screen. It's still going to change a little bit of the feel of the paper for you. For the discussion, the subheadings are pretty set: limitations, practice applications, future research. You want to make sure that you have a paragraph that summarizes the problem and main findings. And usually you don't really need to do any more subdivisions, but if you do, make sure that it's correct. And then you need to have your conclusions. So different papers do conclusions different ways. Sometimes it'll be future research and conclusions. Sometimes conclusions will be part of the discussion, but I've specified just to make it uniform, because when I say do whatever you want, I find that students make a lot more mistakes. I've specified that conclusions needs to be centered, just like literature review and discussion is. So reference page should start either page 7 or page 8. If it starts later than that, that means you have too many pages and probably lost some points for that. And so things like the hanging indent, and then for references, I tried to tell you either the first, second, or if you had more than 3, any mistakes goes on this, any mistakes in the last 3 goes over here, to try to tell you where the mistake is And for this, you have to be really detail-oriented because things like spacing, one word capitalized wrong, all of those things I deduct some points for. So look carefully. If you have looked and still aren't sure what's wrong with it, ask a friend or bring it to office hours. Citations. So you need to have at least one citation per paragraph. I don't think I really looked at this when I was doing your rubrics the first time, but now that I've noticed it, I probably will the next time. Your citations. So this one, I wasn't able to track quite as well which one it was, but I still tried to give you some direction as to what's wrong. If you lost any points, it's a good idea to check every single reference, just to be clear. If you're still, and there's a lot of examples online, there's a lot of templates and a lot of resources. So I am expecting you to do this mechanics part perfectly, but we've spent a lot of time and there's a ton of resources available to help you do it. For quotes, if you have a quote that's 40 words or longer, and you can see, so down here, you'll see, so I have highlighted a piece, and it tells me how many words it is right down here. So it's extremely easy to count how many words are in a quote. So if it's 40 words or greater, it needs to be a block quote style. I'm just going to leave that up to you because it's a level of complexity I don't want to introduce to the whole class. My best recommendation is to actually just use a smaller portion of the quote or cut the quote out, because it's probably not worth risking, because if you format it wrong, I'm going to take off points. It's just not worth the risk. Quotes in general, make sure that you're using your quotation marks, because otherwise it's plagiarism. But also that you're using, it says reference, but I really mean citation. You're including the page number and that you're punctuating it correctly. Here's a big one that I noticed: no more than 3 short quotes or 1 long quote. So I'm very clear about how many quotes you're allowed to have. What I find is that some students rely on quotes too much as they go through, so they're using a lot of quotes and it ends up being not really much of their words. And part of it is because you feel like that's what you need to do to use the information, but for academic writing, you really don't need to use very many quotes. If you look through your articles and their lit reviews, usually they'll only use a quote if it's something pretty interesting. A lot of them probably have no quotes at all in them, because the idea is that you paraphrase and then you give the citation. And so I'm trusting you as an academic to have paraphrased correctly. And if I don't trust you, I can go look up the article and check. So you focus on putting things in your own words unless it's a very, very technical definition or a very, not even technical, but a very sort of standard, well-worded definition potentially could be in your own words. If I've specifically told you to put something in your own words, I'm going to look in the final version that you have done that. Other things, if it's quotes from like participants in a study or some sort of interesting quote, then I will occasionally give permission ahead of time to use more than 3. But in general, keep it to 3 or fewer, and you don't need to have any. Actually, there's some of the best written papers don't use any quotes. So down here, there's the 4 pieces that are more writing style that I look at. One is no contractions. So that's still, that's not hard to do. That's just going through and finding all your contractions. Another one is no use of I, me, my, you, your, or we, us, our. It should stay third person. You can say they and them, because that's talking about either the authors, the participants, someone else. But don't include yourself or do that sort of second person you. So again, it's just a matter of finding all of them and updating them, changing them a little bit. No use of the article titles. So you never say in blah, 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 blah article, this person did this. That's just it's not what we do for scientific writing. Instead, it's almost like, so if you were to go on to do a lot of research in this field, in your little corner of the research, you would quickly actually get to know the other people doing the research. Like in my dissertation, I know several of the people that I quoted. Some of them I'm Facebook friends with. And so or not quoted, but cited. And so you're talking about the work they did. The article itself is just the documentation of the work they did. So you're talking about them and their work, like Smith and West study did, or, you know, Smith and West 2015 found. And you don't need to say like in 2015 Smith and West found. Just use their name, and over time what you notice is it's kind of like the citations just sort of disappear. You don't really read them as part of the text as you get more familiar with academic writing. So they're just kind of subtle, they fade into the background. So I've gone through a lot of stuff here. Any questions about the APA rubric? Right. Any questions about these 4 items here that are more writing style? I remembered, especially for the formatting, especially the computer stuff, Dr. Ling has a series of videos where he talks about how to format different things. And for this, I'm really looking for everybody to have 100, because I gave you feedback about where you were on track, where you weren't. Hopefully you got pretty detailed feedback from a peer also. And so I'm really hoping that everyone in the class comes out with full points for APA style, because it's all about just the mechanics. It's just rules. All right, the next part of the rubric is about actually how you're writing. So, and some of this is a little funky. I'm going to update it a little for the next time I use it. So the abstract, first of all, there's 11 categories. So you get a little wiggle room. You could lose a point in every category and still come out with full credit. So for the abstract, what I'm really looking for is that it's a complete overview of the paper, meaning it tells me really the main points of the whole thing, just like the abstracts for your articles are, that it's like a snapshot of your total paper. So that includes your thesis statement, your main themes, a little bit about each theme, and maybe some of your limitations and practice applications, future research, things like that. And I'm looking for it to be 150 to 250 words. Because again, when I had said, oh, I'm not going to be super duper picky, I found that I kept getting shorter than I wanted. So add a little bit to it if you need to get it up in that 150 to 250 range. Any questions about the abstract so far? Okay. The introduction, I'm looking for it to be a 1 paragraph where you're introducing the topic, and really the order that it's written here is very much the order that works well to present it. So you address the topic and a main idea. So you sort of, your first couple sentences are introducing the topic, maybe giving me just a teeny tiny bit of background. And then you're going to bring in this thesis statement where you're taking a position, making a claim, and so it's a topic and an assertion. Then you're providing a roadmap for the rest of the paper. So you're really spelling out what are the themes I'm going to talk about, how am I developing and supporting this idea, this topic, or this thesis that I'm making. And then what's here in this section, the rest of the intro should match up with the order and the way that you introduce your main points. Because for this, you're crafting a story. You're telling me this is what I want you to believe at the end, and here's how I'm going to convince you. And then you go through and you work your way through convincing me, one logical argument at a time. Any questions about the introduction? Okay. After that, you have the heading literature review, and you have sort of a 1 paragraph right underneath that. We'll talk more. Actually, I'm going to switch up a little bit because I feel like the things I'm saying here might be better talked about with the template. So I'm going to talk about the template, and then I'm going to go back. So the template, again, it's best to really spend some time side by side, make sure that it looks, even things like where the margins are. Some people, it was lower, like it's on this first line. And I realized Google Docs actually will do headers now, and they'll even do a different first header. So you may be able to write the entire APA paper in Google Docs now. They may have enough formatting for you to do that. Although you still have to download it as like a Word or PDF for me to be able to grade it. So running head on the first one, and then your short article, make sure that this is the right font, and that it's either sort of here or here. If it's all the way out here, you probably have an extra tab somewhere. Abstract, again, this one looks a lot shorter than it should. So it's, yeah, this one's 64, so it's less than half as long as your abstract actually needs to be. And again, I suggest writing it last, and then keywords needs to look exactly like this in terms of where it's indented, what's uppercase. Follow this exactly. And if you're not sure, if you're not sure what's just the way I did this versus the rule, pull up a few samples and see, okay, what do they do differently, but what do they all do? Usually what's the same across several sample papers is going to be correct. And make sure you're getting like samples from a library, not just trying to find a paper that someone, like, this is a paper I wrote and I put it online, because they might not have done it correctly. Usually things from a library have been done correctly. So next you start out with the title of your paper. You have this roadmap paragraph. So you describe your main points, includes a thesis paper, your themes that somehow support or explain, and you want to start explaining to me why you've chosen to include the arguments you have. Kind of like a lawyer, you've chosen your evidence carefully, but you have to explain to me as the judge or jury, you have to explain what these pieces of evidence mean, why these pieces of evidence support your thesis. And if you rearrange your paper, then these overview paragraphs need to rearrange to match. Here, one thing I noticed, people weren't sure, some people left it out, this first paragraph under the heading literature review. And there's a couple things you can do with that paragraph. One is you can just kind of extend your introduction a little if you don't have anything good to put, but you can put a lot of your background information here. So like defining a few key terms, or telling me, let's say you're talking about autism, you might put a little brief background information about autism in there. And so this is where you're reintroducing, you're laying some groundwork, and you're getting ready for the next themes. This paragraph, I think, feels the most forced of any of the paragraphs in the paper, partly because I'm imposing this really specific structure, but there are ways to do it. I'm not looking for it to be amazing, I'm just looking for it to be an effort and do some things. And then you go into your themes, make sure that you're doing bold, flush left, uppercase, and you don't need to say themes. It just says theme 1 because I'm telling you what to put there. And so you discuss a theme, it's usually, and you don't want your theme to be too long, it should be fairly short, the actual title you use, and then you'll do usually 2 to 4 paragraphs for each theme. It's important that each theme has a topic sentence, which you'll see in the rubric, and I gave a lot of feedback about topic sentences. One sentence that really says, what's the purpose of this paragraph? With good writing, and this is a good tip as finals creep up and everybody's super busy, if you read through our textbook, if you read the first line of each paragraph, you get a pretty good sense of what the chapter's about. You don't get the details, but you get a really good sense of the main points. And it should be the same way with your paper. If I just look through your topic sentences, I should be able to track the main points of your paper pretty easily. Each paragraph should have at least one source cited, and I'm looking for that to be within the first, usually like somewhere around the second sentence, because the first topic sentence is usually broader, and then you start making your point based on your readings. Because this is just a lit review, all you're really doing is repeating your readings to me. So you don't need, you're not giving me general knowledge or your opinion, you're building a case from these readings. If you're having a paragraph that only has one source, you probably want to cite it usually twice, maybe 3 times if it's a really long paragraph, just to, again, keep acknowledging that you're getting these ideas from your article. If you're having multiple cites, then you just need to cite every time you switch, or anytime it might be ambiguous which one you're getting it from. And you should, if you have no paragraphs that have more than one citation, you probably have that serial book report feel, where you're talking about each article completely separately from the others. It feels choppy, and it's not the purpose of this paper. So you want to make sure you have at least some where you're integrating ideas from multiple articles to make some point. It may be that you just need to combine a couple short. You were very focused on one idea at a time with your paragraphs, And you need to just make it a slightly more complex idea so that you can talk about, you can do more of that integration. And then you'll usually, so I've asked you to do at least 2 themes. 2 themes seems to be what works best. When people go much beyond 2, it starts to get a little confusing for me often as a reader. If you have more than 2, you would want to consider whether you should really just transform one of those themes into background information. But that's up to you. And so you can also use subheadings if you want. With as short as these are, it's really not that big of a deal. Why is that underlined? That shouldn't be underlined. That should be italicized. That's weird. So I recommend 2 themes, introduce each theme, and make a few points related to it. And again, especially if you got a low score in terms of logical development, part of it is it felt like you were just kept throwing fact after fact after fact rather than arranging them. And you probably have some rationale in your head for why you chose every fact, but you didn't really explain that to me. You didn't tell me what to expect or why these 2 things fit together. So it may not be about rewriting everything, but just more about adding in pieces that explain to me what your rationale was, why this all fits. Any questions so far about the lit review? And what I may actually do is start kind of going back and forth. So for the body, again, we're looking to see that each element supports and develops the main idea, so that you have subpoints, that you're contributing, that you're building this argument, and that each paragraph has a clear topic sentence and leads into the next paragraph too, that there's these things that help me as a reader know what you're trying to say. It's not enough to just tell me your point. You also have to tell me the evidence. You also have to tell me why the evidence supports your point. Okay. So the discussion. And the discussion is where I think there was the most confusion about what sections are supposed to do. So under the discussion, so let me take a step back. Some people used this first paragraph after the discussion as the place where they really tried to integrate the information. The integration should be happening in the lit review. You should be integrating sort of as you go. The discussion is another overview paragraph, so it's going to match pretty closely with your abstract and your introductory paragraph. So you're just kind of restating why are we talking about this and what did you tell me? Because again, you know what the points you're trying to make, but you know when you were reading other people's drafts, it was harder to follow. And so these paragraphs really did help. Any questions of what's supposed to go into this paragraph? Okay. And part of the rubric is just, did you have this paragraph that was an overview? Now, limitations is the first section. And I think actually here in my template, it's a little longer than it needs to be. I think more like half a page is enough. But this is the part where you are critiquing your articles. So you're saying what was wrong with them. And so and it's not just your opinion, it's scientifically what was the critique. If we look at the rubric, we see for discussion, it says, begins with 1 paragraph to summarize the main arguments. And then it says, original critiques of studies methodology and interpretation. So methodology is things like, what people did they use? How did they define autism? Where did they do the study? How old, what race, all those sorts of things. That's methods. What order did they give the questions in? Sometimes that's something you would critique. Because if you're trying to measure, say, racism, and you ask someone questions about racism first and then give them 2 resumes, one has a traditionally Caucasian sounding name, one has a traditionally African American sounding name, and you ask them which resume, which person would you interview? Well, they have a sense that you're asking about race because you already asked them about race. Those are the sorts of methodology things you might critique. Interpretations is something I want you to know about. I'm not really expecting you to do it at this level. By the time you get to experimental, you probably want to be able to do more of this kind of thing. Interpretations means, okay, here's your findings, here's your data, here are the numbers you got based on the questions you asked. What does that mean? What kind of claims are you making? How are you interpreting that data? And sometimes someone is either using a test, like using a t-test with a population that violates the assumptions. These words should sound familiar from my stats classes. Or they are really kind of just making a logical leap that's not justified. So you could critique that, well, the data, it doesn't say what you're trying to tell me it's saying. That would be the interpretations. I'm not asking you to really do that. It's more of sort of what people are they including, how are they asking the questions. If you're just critiquing methodology, for this class, I'm okay with that because it's still a start to critical thinking. And then I'm also looking whether it includes suggestions for applications and future research. So I'm focused most on the limitations, but I'm also looking at those other things. Any questions on what goes into limitations? And again, the template has a lot of suggestions for things you could do, and you can draw inspiration from the limitations section of your articles. One thing about the limitations, this is a place where people, again, tend to go into serial book report mode, where they talk about Article 1 has this, this, and this problem. Article 2 has, etc. Instead with this, I want you to try to group by theme. So if you're going to talk, for example, about race, that your samples weren't racially diverse enough, you would say racial diversity was a problem in however many articles. Excuse me. And then you could go through and explain in more detail, like this article had this many, had this racial breakdown, this one had this, or you could just say, racial diversity, these articles had a lack of diversity in terms of racial background of the participants. And so you can do that. That's a much shorter way of saying it if you're listing several. Really for the limitations, I'm looking for about half a page. So you could go into depth on like 2 limitations, or you could list several shorter like that. Like, these ones had an issue with this, and then just kind of cite. Make sense? Okay. So it looks like about a page here. Really half a page is enough for me. Practice applications. This section really seems to be pretty challenging for people just in terms of figuring out what's supposed to go here. So practice means like working in the field with people. So for me as a counseling psychologist, practicing would be doing therapy. For a nurse, practicing would be working as a nurse with patients. It basically means not research. That's the other, you could do research, you could do practice. So practice is where we talk about what should professionals be doing. And for this, it's important to stay very close to your thesis and your points. So for example, if you're talking about social media and depression, you wouldn't want to talk about background stuff for depression, like people who have depression should do X, Y, and Z. Instead, you want to talk specifically about social media. So for example, therapists who are working with someone who's depressed may want to screen for how much social media they're using and may want to recommend that they limit social media, things like that. And so you want to have at least 2 suggestions and focus on professionals. So for example, if you think if it's something parents should do, you would say, well, family therapists or teachers or whoever should tell parents to do such and such. So here you see an example. So marriage counselors, including pastoral counselors who work with couples, should tell couples to try to high five at least 10 times a day. Or sort of encourage the distribution of PSAs. So I would say the government should create PSAs with messages that promote quality time between teens and their parents. Yes?
When should we stop having citations for each paragraph?
So if you look through the template, I'm pretty clear, there's usually a clear statement that says citations, and if you did like a search citation, you could see pretty easily in each section. So for example, the limitations should have citations because you're talking about each study's specific problems. Whereas up here, the discussion, If you're talking more broadly in this first paragraph, you might not have any citations. So there's not a clear cutoff in terms of from this point on in the paper you don't need them, but there is, I give you guidance on each section what you need to do. So for the practice applications, most people do not need citations because you're talking about your thesis. This is where you're really doing your own work. However, if you are focusing on one really specific study, if you are saying, well, this study found this, so you should blah, 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 if it's that specific, then you would want to cite it. So in some of these where I say you may not have any citations, like here you might not have citations in this paragraph, but cite if you refer to a specific paper's idea. And if you're not sure where it goes, that's a specific enough question you could probably email me. Again, if you give me a little bit of a head start, you could probably email me and I can tell you either yes or no for whether you need to cite that. Or you could just drop by office hours pretty quickly. Any other questions about practice applications? And the reason that you talk about professionals is because this is not being published in Parenting Magazine or on a blog that parents read. This is in a journal. You know, you're writing this as if it would be in a journal that other professionals are reading. And so you're speaking to other professionals about what they need to do. And you could talk about what they should encourage people to do. But you're still talking about it from the perspective of, I'm a professional, you're a professional, and I'm telling you what you should do based on this information. Future research, this should match your limitations. This is where you say what studies should be done next to make the next move in the field. Future research is one thing. When I was an undergrad, I remember feeling very overwhelmed, thinking that research is so complicated and there's been so many really clever studies and I can't come up with that, I can't contribute. But what I find as now that I'm a researcher with way more ideas than I could ever possibly study, is that it's usually just one little step ahead of what's been done in the past. That's what most research is. You're just moving the boundary a little bit. And so for this, it should match your limitations section. If you complained that there wasn't enough racial diversity in the samples, then your future research would be, we should do this research with more diverse samples. And so if I dinged you on that, if I told you you need to have those match up, then I'm not really picky about which way you change it as long as it looks the same at the end. So you could change your future research to match what you had talked about in limitations, but you could also go back and put whatever you wanted to do research on as a limitation, that they haven't studied this in the schools or whatever it is. So there's more than one way to fix a lot of these problems with consistency. And I give a few, again, in here, I give a few ideas of ways that you can do it. And for this paper, I'm letting you stay pretty concrete with things like participants, regions, like with autism spectrum disorders, you could say, well, you need to be more clear of who's being included in the sample because it's a spectrum. Some people only focus on severe autism, others include the whole spectrum. And there's a lot of ways, even just at the sample level, you can talk about a lot. And again, this paragraph, I wouldn't expect there to be a citation, but if you're saying like repeat this specific person's study with a more diverse sample, obviously you would cite that person. Any questions on the future research? Okay. So again, just to kind of go back and look at how it's, so for the discussion, I'm looking to see how well you did all of those things. Because the discussion has a lot of very specific tasks to accomplish. And the template gives you a really clear idea what I'm looking for. And then there's a conclusion, and it's very short in mine because I ran out of room. I understand if you run out of room and are cramping a little. If it's really short and choppy and you still have space though, I'm not gonna be very happy. And this is just yet another overview paragraph. It should read very similarly to your other three overviews, the abstract, the introduction, the discussion summary paragraph, and the conclusion. They're all very similar. There are different accepted ways for doing it, but for this class, I'm telling you specifically, just put conclusions in the middle, because I find when I tell you do it however you want, it gets more confusing for students and harder for me to grade. So I'm just going with a clear, this is how I want it. And a lot of journals and things that you would submit papers to will do the same thing. They'll tell you very clearly how they want something to be submitted. And so you need it to be at least 3 sentences, and you need to focus on repeating your thesis, repeating the main points. A really great conclusion is going to be 4 to 6 sentences. But everything needs to be at least 3 sentences for me to even consider it being a paragraph. And when you look at the rubric, it just tells you, so having it be a full 1 paragraph, summarize the body and conclusion, and that it has a restatement of the main idea or thesis. It summarizes the main subpoints and leaves the reader with an interesting final impression. This is your last chance to change my mind about whatever you've said, to have me remember your points. And so I'm looking to see, and I know it's often sort of the last thing you're writing and you're tired and you're running out of time, but to spend a little time on it. Are we all still good? Okay. The references section, I don't think I hammer that pretty hard on APA, so I don't think I include it in the rubric, in the writing rubric, but making sure that you're doing the hanging indent, and let me go over again real quick how to set that up. So most of your paper is either not indented, or you might set it up to have a first line indent, which is more like a paragraph structure. You see how the first line is the one that's indented, but you just go to paragraph and you tell it to do a hanging indent, and then it'll do it for you. You don't really need to do it. You can also do it up here under the ruler. You can kind of move where things are. Sometimes it'll move the whole thing. You should be able to get it to move just part of it if you click in the right place though. So you can set it up however you want to. Let me just kind of send it back there. So that's one important piece. You want to make sure you're capitalizing the things you're supposed to and not anything else. Also check for spacing. For example, if for this I'm extremely detail oriented. Again, this is a big part of what we do for this class, and so I'm looking for it to be perfect. So things like if there's, if these things are left together, that's a point off. DOIs, there's multiple ways to do them that are correct, but I'm looking for them to be consistent. So if you do the DOI colon style somewhere, and again, you would lowercase that, and there's no space after the colon. If you do that style somewhere, you have to do this style everywhere. You can't mix this in some references and this in others. I don't have a preference for which one you use for this class. I probably will state which one I want in the future. But for this class, I don't have a preference, but it needs to be uniform. Also, again, this is another thing that I'm not really focused on for this class, but that for future classes I'm going to enforce, and it may be what your professors expect for your future classes. If there is no DOI, APA style says that you should include a permalink. This one you can obviously see there is a DOI attached to the article, but it's something where if I click it, it'll take a minute because my noise takes a minute, but it'll take me to the article's page, and you can see, so I could access the page from here. So it's not just whatever you got from PsycInfo. That'll almost never work. One important website to show you is Crossref. This is what I use when I'm checking to see if you have a DOI. This is the, so I actually didn't know about it at the very beginning of the semester, so I didn't emphasize it as much to begin with. But this is my sort of gold standard. If I search in Crossref and it's not there, I say, okay, it doesn't exist. But if I search, does anyone have the name of a article that they couldn't find a DOI for? All right, I'll just use beliefs about college student. I don't know what that'll bring up. So you can see, you can just kind of search. Usually I'll use, let's see, I'll use this one. So this one, if I search, so let's say I have this article that I'm trying to use. If I copy it, usually I'll use quotes to make sure I get exactly that article. Sometimes if a few different things come up and I'm not sure I can find it, I'll search with the article then, or with, I'm sorry, with one of the authors. So I'll say like Zhang. And it usually comes up, and I'll just kind of copy the link. And then one of the ways to check to make sure that your link, whatever it is a permanent link. So like this link, I know it works because if I go to another computer or another browser, like for me, I use Safari to test this because I usually work in Chrome. So go to a different browser on your computer or a completely different computer and put in the address and see if it still brings up the article. So again, that's not really something I'm looking for this time, but I want to make sure that you know it for the future. Any other questions about the reference list? Okay. So let me finish the rubric now. So support for claims is basically how well are you developing a claim? Are you just kind of listing me off a list of facts from your articles? Or are you using topic sentences and the way that you order it to really develop an argument that's easy to follow? Clear and concise is about how direct your wording is. Part of this is, I think students are used to trying to fill a page, and so they use kind of meandering writing when they don't need to. And so this is about, are you really getting to the point? Are you saying it in a clear way? And are you using, APA style actually has suggestions for how to be concise in writing. Emphasis is basically, are you clearly focused on a couple points, or are you just kind of, do I feel overwhelmed with information? Usually emphasis and support for claims tend to go together along with logical development, because it's about, are you doing these topic sentences? Are you explaining why pieces of evidence are important in terms of your argument? Logical development, ideas build on each other, they're in a logical order, and I don't usually have to look back to understand things. This has to do with, did you lay the groundwork in the intro paragraph? Are you using topic sentences all the way through? Style is talking about, are you being academically appropriate? Is this the sort of thing that might get published in a journal? Or an easier one to think of might be like the school newspaper. If you were writing an article for a school newspaper, so you know, it's obviously you're a student, you're not trying to trick anyone into thinking you're a 50-year-old reporter, but you are trying to sound professional. So one of the things, like affectation is a word that means unnatural or artificial expression meant simply to impress. You're not using big words randomly just to try to, you know, you don't need to use huge words. You just need to cut out some of the more slangy or smaller words. Like I don't want to hear you say a lot every other sentence. But you don't need to get out a dictionary either. It should sound like you, just like the most professional version of you. No slang, having a variety of sentence structures so it's not feeling choppy with lots of short sentences or tough to navigate with lots of long sentences. And at some level, just how easily can you express yourself through this writing? How easy is it to follow? And then there's another one that's writing mechanics, so things like, a big one is, a lot of these I'm grading in Word, and so it kind of gives you away a little when there's a red squiggly line and you didn't fix it. That's sort of the biggest red flag of, I didn't really do a final read through of my paper. When there's multiple spaces and it has a green squiggly, that's another one that kind of gives you away that you didn't really look through very carefully. So I want to see that you've at least caught the big obvious mistakes, and even, you know, there's not a ton of less obvious smaller mistakes either. And then APA style has rules for grammar, spelling, punctuation, things like that. They're pretty standard, but that's the standard that I use. And so just looking at overall how correct is your writing throughout. So as a reminder, there's 11 categories altogether worth 10 points. I'm taking it out of 100 points, so you have a little room for error right off the top. And then there's 3 funky, one is just it's submitted in an electronic format, so basically you uploaded it correctly, you get points for that. That's generally a freebie 100 points, or 100%. Formatting is it the right length? Does it have the correct formatting? So things like if your headings aren't right, if the APA isn't right, this is where I might ding you. That the total page is correct and that you have included all the required sections. So again, most people get 100 on this, but there were people who lost points on the draft. And then this one didn't count for the revised draft. It's just the final draft. I'm looking to see whether you're actually acting on the feedback from previous drafts. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to take a paper from a C to an A quality. It's not about just did you somehow become a perfect paper. For APA, I do have really high expectations because it's pretty mechanical. There's lots of resources, including my office hours, including the writing center, including the librarians, including tons of stuff online. But for the paper itself, I'm looking to see that you've gone up a point or two in each category, that you have addressed all, that there's no comments that you just completely blew off. And even if you didn't quite get it right, that you at least put some effort in, that you worked on it. Because if there's anything that makes a professor or any teacher go Hulk and smash angry, like, it's when you get a paper back from a student that you had put time into giving feedback and nothing's really changed. The purpose of this assignment is to be one where you get to improve, you get to grow, because most of the other assignments you'll have, you just turn in your final draft and you're done. So that's the reason that this class has such a big paper portion dedicated. So the way I grade it, your APA score, which again should be 100 by the time you turn it in, and your writing score get averaged together. So I add those two up and divide by 2 to get an average score out of 100 points. Then I take these 3 gray boxes, submissions, format, and revision, and I average these 3 numbers. So I add them up, divide by 3, and I get a total percentage. And then you get your points times your percentage to get your final score. And so if you keep your nose clean, do both of these right, and you act on all of your comments and all of the APA stuff, this would be 100%. You would get the full points that you scored here. So it's possible, especially if you wrote a pretty good paper to start with and then made no revisions at all, it's quite possible that you would actually get a lower score on your final draft, because part of the assignment for the final draft is to continue improving the paper. Most people, though, I expect that most people will get a higher score on their final. For one, most of these APA errors should be gone, so that'll increase your score. And then you should have higher scores in most parts of your writing. And again, I'm looking to see that in general, you've put a good bit of effort in to address the comments that I've given. If you got a lot of comments, do the easy ones first, do the more concrete, like fix this citation. If you got a lot of big picture comments and you feel like you're really not going to be able to fully address all of them, feel free to come to office hours and we'll have a conversation about how to prioritize. Which ones am I really wanting to see the most change on? Whew. What questions do you have now? Yes?
You said that the comments, are you talking about the rubric itself, the score itself, or did you actually comment?
There should be actual comments on it.
Because I only saw, unless I just didn't look well enough, I only saw the rubric, so I didn't see.
Anyone else not see comments? Okay. Did you submit it as a Word document or a PDF? Okay. So if you open the Word document, there should be comments in there, and they should look sort of like, let me go to the template. Let's see. So they'll look kind of like this. Now, if you don't see them, probably what you need to do is go to Review and see, like, you want to make sure that it's showing markup. And you want to make sure that it's showing comments specifically. If you're still having trouble, let me know, and I'll figure something out. Worst case scenario, I can send you a PDF instead. That's usually a little messier, but we can do that. And the nice thing about the comments, as you address them, you can delete them. On a Mac, you just hit X, I think on Windows, there's a delete comment thing. So you can kind of clean things up as you go, as you address the comments. What other questions do you have? Yeah.
The early deadline is the 28th, right?
Let's look at the calendar. Let's make it the 29th. So Friday. Honestly, I'm still grading papers for my evening class, and then I have other papers to grade too. But I will start, once I get these papers, let's see. What I will say is, so when I built this schedule, I was focusing on what happened last semester. Last semester, I spent less time with the drafts and more time on the final. This semester, I've kind of flip-flopped that. I've spent a lot of time on the drafts, and I'm hoping to go through the finals a little faster, because I'm really just looking at, like, okay, what parts, you know, what did I give you feedback on, and I'm looking to see where the change is. So my hope is that I will get those graded fairly quickly. But the 29th, Friday, is probably when I'm going to start going through everything that's been submitted for early grading. So if you get it to me by Friday, you should get it back like May 2nd-ish. Yeah, you should be able to get it back by then. Somewhere in there. What other questions do you have? Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't really hear the question, so what you're saying is Friday is the last day for early submission?
Yep.
Okay.
I don't think it's terribly, I think actually it's not going to be so much about whether you got it in. I think it's only going to be a difference of a couple days, honestly, in terms of grading. But there's advantage to being at the top of the pile in terms of when I get to you.
Our final exam.
Your final exam, let me look at my exam schedule. Your final exam is Wednesday for this class. Wednesday, May 11th at 9. If you wanted to take that earlier, you could, because I have another class that's doing it Monday at 9 a.m. So if you wanted to get it out of the way, I have no problem with that. But Wednesday at 9 a.m. is your scheduled time.
The final's going to be the same format as all the other presentations?
Almost. The final is actually going to be a little bit easier in some ways because intelligence we're going to do more briefly. Just in terms of content, something's got to give a little bit, and so I make it intelligence. And so we'll go over a little bit in class. I'll also post, I had to record a lecture for another class, so I'll post that lecture for you guys to have also. And then it's a take-home exam. So after we do the intelligent portion, I will give you your take-home exam, and you'll just bring it back to the final exam time. So you'll have one chapter with like a normal amount of questions, and then this take-home. I will warn you, I was shocked that I had people miss questions on the take-home exam. I don't understand how it happens. So, and the take-home will be 15 multiple choice and 2 essay. And I think I give you like 3 essay to choose from or something. And you can type it up if you want. I'm not fussy. It's easier for me to read type anyway.
So it's 2 parts. It's one in class and the other is take-home.
Yep, so part of it is take home. Part of it will be just like a normal. So it's sort of like we'll have one chapter, like half a test during that period. So it'll be one chapter, the perception chapter. There'll be probably around 25 to 30 questions on it, and then there'll be an essay. And then your intelligence piece, because it's a take-home, has fewer questions and more essays. Yeah?
One, when do we get the take-home? And 2, do we have to take it? I remember you saying that if we got prepared on our paper, that we could potentially find it.
Good questions. So number one, I should remember to bring the take home when we talk about intelligence. So you would get it that day. And so you would have really like a week and a half or 2 weeks to do it. The second is, do you have to do the final? So for this class, your lowest test grade gets dropped. So if you miss any tests, that test is assigned a 0. At the end, your lowest test grade gets dropped. If it's a 0, it just goes away. So the final is considered part of the class, but if you're happy with your grade and you're okay with getting a 0 on the final and having that be the grade that gets dropped, I have no problem. The one thing I'll say, occasionally on, I think once or twice in a recommendation letter for someone, I have specifically said, like, this person completed the optional final, even though they didn't need to. But in general, it just popped into my mind that I do, I don't know. It shows that you're an overachiever, but you certainly don't need to do that. Typically the great students, I can find lots of things to talk about in letters of recommendation. So, did that answer your question about the final? All right. So of all the tests to drop, it's actually probably in many ways the easiest test, but it's at the time where you're often the most stressed out in the semester. So I do not take any of this personally, just the policy is the policy. So I won't be mad if you don't come. Yeah.
Usually you grade the tests.
As normal, I have the multiple choice portions fully graded. The essays, no, because I still have papers that people need back, which take priority. So I should be able to start grading the essays on Wednesday, I'm hoping. I do have the multiple, I think I might even have them with me. So if you want to see what you got on the multiple choice, you probably can. But the essays, again, I include them for you guys. They're more work for me to grade. They slow things down. Any other questions? All right, I will stick around for a few minutes if you wanted to go over anything specific to your paper.